In an article in Le Monde reproduced in Folha de São Paulo on the 2nd, critics Michel Guérin and Jacques Mandelbaum point out some fabrications staged by Austrian director Hubert Sauper in the documentary Darwin's Nightmare to impress the audience with the imagined harms of capitalist globalization. But they end up praising the film on the grounds that the thesis it defends by dishonest means is true and appropriate. They acknowledge that if ideological propaganda does not honestly present itself as such, what is intended as an allegorical project can be apprehended by the audience as an accumulation of irrefutable facts. They even admit that, with Sauper's film, we are not far from the principle that the end justifies the means, but ultimately excuse the director by arguing that the film must be evaluated through the filmmaker's subjective lens and invoke in his favor the motto of another cinematic trickster, Johann van der Keuken, according to whom the deception matters little. The foundation must be just. Sauper's initiative is nothing new. It reflects the essential tradition of leftist documentary filmmaking, which began lying with Dziga Vertov's Cinema Verite, continued with Jean Rauch, and recently reached its peak mendacity with Michael Moore. In this sense, the activity of the modern Western artistic elite has hardly differed from the KGB's fraud industry. On the contrary, it has often been nothing more than the elegant commercialization of their products. The justification presented is also not new. To lie for the sake of truth, said Brecht, is the fundamental duty of the communist militant. With equal good conscience, KGB officials erased inconvenient excerpts from the collective memory stored in encyclopedias and dictionaries every year, reshaping the past in the light of the desired future. But, between us, if someone has a general and abstract thesis about reality, the so-called just foundation, and gathers singular and concrete images in a film to argue for it, those images stand to the thesis exactly as evidence does to theory. Artistic evidence need not be complete, exact, or rigorous, but it is a kind of evidence nonetheless. If the film did not intend to prove anything, not even implicitly, it would not be a thesis work, neither for nor against anything. It could not therefore have the meaning of a political argument, which is precisely what these documentaries intend to be. Now, in a normal human brain, evidence reinforces the truthfulness of the thesis. The truthfulness of the thesis rests on the evidence. In the logic of Messrs. Michel Guérin and Jacques Mandelbaum, as well as Dziga Vertov, Rauch, Michael Moore, and Sauper, what happens is the opposite. The evidence, even if false, must be accepted as good because the thesis is given as true. The thesis is not proven by the evidence. Rather, the evidence is proven by the thesis it simultaneously simulates to demonstrate. Imagine a young man trying to enter a nightclub at 3 in the morning, showing as proof of age a clearly forged document. This document is no good, says the bouncer. It is good. Since I'm of legal age, that proves the document proves it. This reasoning mimics those Escher drawings, where a hand, seeming to emerge from the paper, draws itself. But this trick requires a flesh-and-blood draftsman who, from outside the paper, creates the illusion. What the intellectual leftist trickery of the Moors, and the like, tries to foist upon us is that the hand, if drawn, really created itself. When psychiatrist Joseph Goebbels said that mass ideologies have a logical structure identical to psychotic delusions, it was this kind of reasoning he referred to. What intellectual respectability can a charlatan who produces such reasoning aspire to? Or worse, the half-crazed person who lets himself be carried away by it, swept to the seventh heaven of stupidity at the very moment he believes he is being very clever and profound. All leftist militancy, without exception, consists of 4 types of people: tricksters, suckers, tricksters becoming suckers without abandoning trickery, and suckers becoming tricksters without ceasing to be suckers. The 2 extremes are rare. In fact, they are pure Weberian ideal types that do not exist in reality. The effective leftist population consists of sucker tricksters and trickster suckers, in a perpetual exchange of positions. Mr. Palachi, who was not very much a sucker, entered transition when he began frequenting Mrs. Jean Mary Corner's house. Mr. Lula, who was not very much a trickster, progressed rapidly. It's all the same from this standpoint. The citizen's cultural level doesn't matter. Shamelessness and idiocy in equal doses to those of a Lula or a Palachi can be observed even among the most sophisticated leftist intellectuals, like Messrs. Michel Guerin and Jacques Mandelbaum. When Roberto Campos said there was no leftist who was both intelligent and honest, he still hoped some might possess at least one of those qualities separately. But cunning is not intelligence, and stupidity is not honesty. The leftist mindset is precisely that, clever in fraud and stupid in the illusion of probity. Messrs. Guerin and Mandelbaum have, of course, no notion that their concept of artistic honesty is merely a psychotic symptom. They are so imbued with the feeling of being sublime thinkers that they fail to see the massive stupidity of what they say. The audience of pedantic pseudo-intellectuals who delight in the uncultured sections of Folha eagerly hop into their canoe, feeling very smart. Do they see how intelligence, the more it withers, the less the citizen realizes its absence? The fact that this duo's article appears in Le Monde and Folha is, moreover, quite natural, since the notion of truthfulness they espouse is the literal expression of the journalistic concept practiced there. Means and ends. A revolutionary ideology is not a theory about reality, much less a plan of action. It is a fictional plot, an imaginary story in which the follower, militant, or believer tries to convince himself he is participating, and whose apparent unity provides a simulacrum of coherence and meaning to his fragmented and scattered life. Every revolutionary ideology identifies good with the future, with a vague state of fulfillment to be reached at an uncertain date by means not clearly explained. The nebulous indefinition of the envisioned image does not disturb the believer's conscience at all. On the contrary, it is essential to the persuasive effectiveness of the ideological discourse. If the future sought were subject to rational definition and meticulous description, it would immediately become an object of discussion, losing the prestige of mystery, the source of its sacred authority. The objective remains undefined not only in its consistency, but also, of course, regarding its date. But this is not just the natural uncertainty of the future. It is rather a double and retroactive uncertainty. When, for example, a socialist regime is established in Russia or Cuba, the entire worldwide militant movement proclaims the victorious advent of socialism. But since these regimes can only survive on violence and crime, which looks very bad, it must also be proclaimed that this disgrace happens only because they are not yet true socialist regimes. Thus, the arrival of socialism is uncertain not only in the future, but also in the past. We do not know when it will arrive, and when it arrives, we cannot even know if it really did. For these reasons, when Mr. Luiz Inácio confesses to his comrades of the São Paulo Forum, we don't know what kind of socialism we are seeking. No one among them calls him irresponsible for convening them on a journey with an unknown destination. The undefined cannot be contested, and even bestows on the bearer of the message a charming aura of modesty and realism. The guide is trustworthy precisely because he doesn't know where he is leading the caravan and does not even pretend to have the slightest idea about it. The indefinition of the ends spreads no insecurity among the faithful because it corresponds, in dialectical opposition, to the strict organization of means and rigid discipline of the agent corps. The less the militants know where they are going, the more they cling to the present certainty of their tasks and group solidarity. They all dedicate themselves with greater intensity, the less they know what on earth they are actually dedicating themselves to. The balance between these extremes is so fragile that any intrusion of external reality, any adversity, no matter how fleeting and trivial, immediately awakens panic, horror, paroxysmal revolt against the abolition of the plot's meaning. No exclamation, no hyperbole, no paranoid fantasy, no aberrant slander should be spared in the effort to exorcise the danger. The psychological security of the community is everything. In its defense, anything said against the attacker is valid. Since the root of security consists in continuing to believe in the plot, the lie used to restore it counts as a symbol of truth. This is why the leftist lies for the sake of the truth. The hairier the lie, the greater the proof of loyalty in defending the plot. Hence the feeling of personifying the truth at the very paroxysm of the lie. Against the university. Obviously, one of the factors that most contributes to making people idiotic to this extent is the university education they receive. In Brazil, this reaches a rarely equaled perfection. With 30 years of experience directing philosophy study groups, with occasional forays into university institutions where my students failed to find the education they sought and therefore left to attend my courses. I can assure you that the Brazilian university, in its vast majority, is today a useless entity detrimental to the public interest, dedicated to pseudoculture, political propaganda, and exploitation of popular good faith. The difference between private and public schools, from this point of view, is negligible. It consists only in that the former is paid for by those who attend, the latter by taxes from the multitude of workers who cannot attend it. Neither provides a service worthy of payment, but one exploits its own clientele, the other the rest of the population. If some people still believe that the latter hypothesis is the less indecent of the two, this is only explained by the degree of stupidity they acquired in the course of their own university education. The honorable record of achievements of a few technical and scientific schools, especially military ones, proves nothing against what I am saying. On the contrary, the disproportion between these islands of sincerity and the sea of pretense that surrounds them is so great that the success of the part only makes the failure of the whole more depressing. Some of my students, recognizing this state of affairs, nevertheless do not dare admit that all is lost. They believe it is worth submitting their intellects to massacre for a few years in exchange for a university job that will allow them later to act within the very belly of the monster and try to lead it back to decent behavior. Thus, after some years in my courses, where they learn what no one taught them in universities, they return to some faculty, hoping that the education they acquired with me will give them the strength to come out unscathed from the daily attendance of these temples of stupidity, to the point of one day being able to fight inside for authentic teaching and a better Brazil. They are deluded. Not even I would survive that experience. Entering one of those institutions with the intention of transforming it into a genuine university is like entering a lion's den hoping to convert them to vegetarianism. The Brazilian university cannot be improved. It must be abandoned, despised, forgotten. Almost all of the highest intellectual production in this country already comes from outside this presumptuous, costly, and useless institution. In philosophy, this is even more visible than in other branches of intellectual activity. Mario Ferreira dos Santos, Vicente Ferreira da Silva, Willem Flusser, and Miguel Real himself, despite his position at the Faculty of Law, were never accepted by the academic establishment that, at the same time, admitted its impotence to create a single philosopher. But in literary studies, the same thing happens. Brazilian literary criticism withered, dried up, and died without leaving heirs from the moment the university presumption deemed it appropriate to appropriate it, boasting of replacing the empire of science with the realm of amateurism. In social sciences, the marginalization of brilliant talents such as Gilberto Freire, Oliveira Viana, and Guerreiro Ramos is enough to show that the Brazilian university long ago made the preferential option for the mediocre and impaired, who by their own ineptitude succumb more easily to blackmail by superiors and the clamor of the militant masses. It is time to make the independence of the life of the spirit in relation to the university bureaucratic caste, already long practiced among us, be publicly assumed, displayed as a pride, and legitimized as a fundamental right, on which the very survival of Brazilian culture depends.